See, when I approach media usage, I have to be aware that I am a temple, that God is with me, that God is central to who I am. I can't approach the television and leave God out of it. I can't buy a book and say, well, God has no say. I can't leave God out of the picture because I am a temple. God belongs inside of me. God dwells inside of me. God lives inside of me, and I have to be aware of what that's about. Our second thing that we've talked about this month, our second boundary that we've picked out, is the fact that we have to be anchored, right? That we are a people who have to be anchored in what it is that God desires. We go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. When we talked about being anchored, we said we want to be anchored first in the person of Christ, right? That we want to understand that you and I have a goal. It is to look like Jesus, and therefore what we do has to be anchored in who Jesus is, in what it is that Jesus has done, in what it is that Jesus has said. And that as we look at those things, we want to make sure that we're following where it is that Jesus goes. You and I are a cross-shaped people. We have to be anchored in the cross of Christ. Sacrifice, love, mercy, forgiveness. Those are hallmarks of who we are. And when we deal with media usage, we don't want to allow anything into our lives that doesn't speak to those things that are true and those things that are noble and those things, and we talked about that list, didn't we? That's what we did last week, was we did the Philippians 4 question, didn't we? How did that go for you? When you sat down to watch a television show, did you ask the question, is this true? Did you ask if it was noble? Did you ask if it was trustworthy? Did it change what you looked at? What you read? Changed what I looked at. You know, there are just times you sit down and go, this is just not as good as I thought it was going to be. This is just not, if I ask the question, this is just not as good for me. This is just not as innocent as I had believed at one point in time. See, that means we're anchored in the cross of Christ. We're allowing Jesus to make those decisions. We're able to sacrifice what it is we need to sacrifice. You and I are being shaped in the character of Christ, aren't we? See, we are anchored in Jesus in every moment. And so he gets a choice in what it is we do with our media. In this passage in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, God dwells within you. Be anchored in the truth that you are not alone. You are bought with a price. God is always present. So what we are is we are anchored in the very presence of Jesus, aren't we? That God walks with us in every place and in every way. When I was a kid, you would do something and my mother would go, would you do that if Jesus was standing right here? You know, I got older and listened to the question and went, get older and listen to the question. And then, I got on into school, into college, and then I decided that was a legalistic question. I decided that, somebody says, well, would you do that if Jesus was standing here? And I'd say, well, that's a legalistic question. My mother used to ask me that because I was a child, and now that I am 40 years old and know better, know what I know, that's a good question. That's a great question because it's a true question. Do the people that you're with affect how you act? I'm ashamed to say that that's true for me. The people that I'm with affect how I act. If I'm with somebody that I want to impress, I'm better behaved. If I'm somebody that I want their respect, I'm smarter. I should at least try to sound smarter. If I don't care, I'm a slob. I just some days, right? Some days we're just like that. Who I'm with sometimes affects my behavior. More than that, when I'm with an old friend, sometimes my behavior may be a little different than somebody I've just met. An awareness of the presence of Christ changes who I am because where I spend my time affects my behavior, affects the way that I think, the way that I act. Jesus will always call me to be better. Jesus will always call me to be the best I can be. And when I'm anchored in the presence of Jesus, when I understand that Jesus is always there, that's when I have the best shot to be at my best. Does that make sense? I hope that it does, because I think that it's important. You and I were created to be aware that we are a temple, a place where God lives. We are supposed to be anchored in the presence of God in our lives to understand that he's always there. And we are supposed to be armed. I think those are the three things that God gives us over and over and over again in our lives that help us make the best decisions about what it means to look like Jesus in our media. If we can be aware of the threat, be aware of the purpose of media, if we can be anchored in the person of Jesus, and if we can be armed with what it is that God desires to do in our lives. We've talked about the fact that God desires to arm us in our hearts, in our souls, in our minds, in our strength. He doesn't look at us and say, I want part of you to be protected and part of you just to be out there. He says, I want all of you to be protected. And God lays boundaries in place in order for us to be a people who are armed to stand against the world, who are armed to be safe in a world that looks at us and says, oh, you don't have to worry about that, or oh, you need to go this way, or oh, you need to do that thing, or oh, you need to... No. God says, I want every piece of you, and I will protect every piece of who you are. He says, I will give you wisdom to deal with what it is that the world passes out. I will give you wisdom to deal with what it is the world has to say, and I want you to be armed with what it is that I want you to do. I want you to be armed with the knowledge of where it is that I want you to go. But it's more than knowledge. God says, I want you to be armed with the power of God. God says, I will stand in your life and will work in your life. I'll stand in your life and be what it is that you need to be. I'll stand in your life and look at what it is that you need to have me look at. And so I go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and I read through there, and I go, I want an arming passage there. He says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. Okay, there's an honoring God there, and I'm looking for armed. I'm looking for... And so I begin to read, and I begin to look, and I begin to say, what is he talking about here? What is the context of the passage? Because I think the arming in this place comes with the context of where the passage is at. If you go back to verse 12, I think we catch the context of the paragraph that Paul is talking about here, where he says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Now, I love that particular passage. Does yours have quote marks in it? Everything is permissible is in quotes? Okay, now some of you may not, but mine has quote marks in it. I always look and say, what's the quote marks are? That Paul, we feel, is quoting from what the popular language of the day is. Okay? That he's writing to the Corinthians about who they are. He's writing to the Corinthians about what he wants them to be. He's writing to the Corinthians about what it is that God desires. The Holy Spirit is at work in this place, writing, speaking through Paul to give them truth. And he says, there's a group of people in your culture that says everything is permissible.